Hello and welcome to the Thursday interview here on Viking.TV with me, Anne Diamond, in a week when we're celebrating the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. Here in the UK, we're enjoying an extended bank holiday weekend, and there are thousands of events all over the country in her honour. Everything from grand church services, Air Force flypasts, Buckingham Palace garden parties, to parades and what we call street parties, where friends and neighbours cordon off their roadway, put out the trestle tables and picnic, quite literally, in their street. In fact, I'm attending one of those myself, judging a fancy dress competition and tasting homemade cakes and jellies. The Queen is Britain's longest ever reigning monarch and possibly the most famous woman in the world. She's 96 and has been on the throne since she was 26. All in all, she's a pretty astonishing woman in a remarkable job. She never gives interviews, so frankly, we know very little about her own private thoughts and opinions. She was brought up to never complain, never explain. But over the years, she has been researched, documented and written about by those who get to know a bit more about her through the inner circle of her friends and relatives. And so it is with my special guest today. He is one of the most best-selling and authoritative of the Queen's biographers, a film and documentary maker, author of at least 4 books about the Queen, and an expert on other members of the royal family too. And his latest book, here, is not only a portrait of the Queen, but it actually sort of sets her in her time. In fact, that's why it's called Queen of Our Times. And it says on the back, it's a study of dynastic survival and renewal, spanning abdication, war, romance, danger, and tragedy. What an intro. Here's Robert Hardman, the author. Hello, Robert.
Hello, Anne. Thanks very much for that.
How do you write a biography about someone you can never actually interview?
It's challenging. Writing about royalty is always intriguing, because the question everybody always asks is, what is she really like? And I think it's a great tribute to her that here we are in her 10th decade and we're still asking that question, because she is this fascinating character. She has lived through every moment of post-war history, if you like, has met every great post-war leader. And has been this sort of figure of permanence and stability, I think, not just in Britain, but really to a large part of the world. I mean, it's amazing to think when she came to the throne, half the countries that exist today didn't exist then. I mean, we had 2 Germanys back then. You had countries like Yugoslavia that don't exist anymore. And she has moved with the times all the way through. She is the most famous woman in the world. Her image is on coins and banknotes and stamps, to the extent that her image is the most reproduced image in history, with the possible exception of Jesus Christ. And yet, she's despite her fame, she's actually quite a reserved person. She never wanted the spotlight. She lives in the spotlight. But she's, never happier than when she's sort of out on the hills in Balmoral. And I think we all have a very settled view of what she's like and who she is. But at the same time, we all want to know more.
Yes, absolutely. We always talk about her having devoted her life to her job, as it were, to her position, that it has been a life of dedication. Now, that dedication, is it nature or nurture?
It's a bit of both. I was very lucky when I was writing this that the Queen herself gave me permission to read her father's wartime diaries. They've never been published. And actually, when you start reading about him and how he went through, the greatest crisis that Britain's ever faced, really, imminent invasion, possible extinction of Britain, and you read how he dealt with that. And she was devoted to her father. She very much, for the first 15, 20 years of her reign, was reigned in his image before she really changed anything. So I think he explains a lot about her. And it really is, it is duty. She was sort of raised on that. Of course, she, like her father, she was never born to be queen. He was never born to be king. It happened because of the abdication of his brother in 1936. Up until then, Princess Elizabeth was destined for a happy life on the sort of periphery, if you like, of royal life, but not the top job. But then suddenly her father is catapulted into this job, which he really doesn't want. I mean, it's very traumatic for the whole family to suddenly be uprooted from their quite cozy existence and plonked in Buckingham Palace. One of the Princess Elizabeth's first words were, "I think everyone around here should ride bicycles. It's so far to get everywhere." You know, it took sort of 10 minutes for the food to arrive from the kitchen. Everything was always cold. It was drafty. They didn't like it. But that's what happened. And from that early age, I think she got this understanding that when you, as it were, abandon your duty or you put yourself before your duty, bad things happen. And that's what happened with her uncle, Edward VIII, or Uncle David, as she knew him. You know, he let the duty bit go. He was more focused on his own life and interests, and obviously his love of Wallis Simpson. And that, I think, left a very, very pronounced early impression on her that, you know, you stick to your duty. And then her father obviously did that all through the war. And again, going back to those diaries, I mean, it's fascinating to read the sort of the real story, because we have this sort of narrative of you know, the royal family were showed a sort of stiff upper lip, and they, throughout the war, they you know, they put on a brave face. But you know, you read the king's account of being dive bombed in his own home. I mean, he and the queen, yeah, very nearly got killed. I mean, it's a miracle they weren't. You know, they saw these two bombs come down and actually hit the ground below his window, and they ran for the door, and all the windows came crashing in. And he writes about how a few days later, he says, "I shouldn't be writing this down, but I can't concentrate. I just keep looking out of the window. I can't read. I don't really want to be here." But he again, duty, you know, he knows he has to press on. He can't just go, and he talks about, "I'm worried about getting a bunker mentality." But he can't do that because he's the king. And so you see how he sort of weathered this. And on another occasion, I mean, a bomb lands just below his study, and he's back working at his desk the next day. The thing hasn't gone off. It was a delayed action fuse. I mean, it was a time bomb. Luckily, it went off at night when he wasn't there. But I mean, you know, he nearly got killed on a number of occasions, and yet he got on with the job. Another story that comes out from the diaries, fascinatingly, which applies to Elizabeth, is, again, we have this sort of settled story that there was never any question of the princesses leaving the country. They were going to stay in Britain, whatever happened. Actually, we find from the diaries he was very keen, worried about getting worried about them getting kidnapped, because there were German paratroopers landing across Europe and trying to kidnap other royal families. And there was a genuine worry that might happen in Britain. He wanted to get the girls out to the USA or to Canada to safety, which is what other royal families were doing. And he writes about going to see Churchill and saying, "Look, I really do think it's time that E and M, Elizabeth and Margaret, you know, we discussed evacuation plans." And Churchill said, "Well, not now. I don't think now's the time." So, you know, he was very worried about his daughters, very worried about his country. And yet, he got on with it, and that's unquestionably left a mark on her. And I think it's why, when you see some of those early challenges that she witnessed, that when you see these sort of crises, that also, you know, we call them crises today, I think she can put them in perspective. Because I think when you've been bombed and you've sort of, you know, worried whether your parents are ever going to come home, and you've been through some of the things she's been through, you know, a family spat is, well, you know, minor.
Yeah, absolutely. Those diaries, were they handwritten by the king?
He handwrote them. They were then transcribed by his secretary, which is a great help, because it meant I could read them in sort of typewritten form. But they're extensive. There's 11 volumes of them. Wow. He started writing them on the day the war started in 1939. And he carried on. He carried on after the war. I mean, they actually run on up to just the end of 1946. And they're fascinating. You know, I thought they'd be quite sort of, you know, just boring appointment diaries, but I mean, there's some fun stuff in there, and you see this sort of extraordinary, sort of incongruous juxtaposition of events, where one minute, you know, the king is receiving the news of Pearl Harbor, and it's all looking desperately bad, and then the next minute the one thing that cheers him up at that time is planning the confirmation service for his daughter, Princess Elizabeth. And you know, he writes in there about her first dance, for example. they were quite lucky. They were able to get their hands on early releases of films. So sort of suddenly in the middle of some sort of air raid, it sort of says, after dinner we watched Dumbo, that sort of thing. And what comes through very much is a devoted family. I mean, I think in so many cases through history, you've had monarchs who have not got on with their predecessors and don't get on with their successors. You think of sort of George III, George IV, or Victoria and Edward VII. There are always these sort of tensions between the generations. That just was not the case between George VI and Elizabeth. She was just devoted to him.
Yeah, I thought I'd show you something, although you've probably seen something like this before. Me and my sisters were going through some of my mother's old treasures and came up with this, which is a souvenir.
Oh, wonderful. I haven't seen that particular one. No, that's great.
Oh, it's lovely. It's May the 12th, 1937, Westminster Abbey, and it was the Coronation. And if you go through it, and I've got a little bit of video of me going through some of the pages, you do start to see that they clearly were a devoted family as a family. And the King and Queen there loved their children. You go into this one, he was a king and emperor, of course, it says there. But you go close in and you see them holding their first child. That's our now Queen Elizabeth, now 96. Isn't that incredible?
It's amazing.
Looking at the dynasty that you describe, and their life there, which was at the Royal Lodge at Windsor. And of course, as you say, they had to move into Buckingham Palace. Lovely pictures of the family there, King and Queen with the Princess there, Elizabeth.
Very lovely, yes.
And you talk about the influences on her life, as you say, her mother and father, but also Queen Mary.
Scary Queen Mary, yes, absolutely.
She is in a carriage with Queen Mary sitting next to her, and Princess Margaret to one side.
Yeah,
fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, Queen Mary was. Actually, was great because she made sure that Princess Elizabeth had a really proper education. I mean, George VI and Queen Elizabeth, who we know as the Queen Mother. They were very modern parents for their day. They didn't believe in sort of packing the children off up into the nursery and just seeing them at bedtime. The first thing every morning was that the girls would come into their bedroom for what they called romps. They'd be sort of, playing around, pillow fights, that sort of thing. I mean, it was a very happy family existence. Lots of dogs. We saw in those lovely pictures you showed us there, Anne. Dogs, ponies, gardens. The king loved his garden. It was a very sort of homely family existence, completely at odds with the future Edward VIII, who liked his sort of fast set and his playboy lifestyle and his cocktails and his yachts. George VI, he just liked being at home with his family, and that's reflected in where the Queen's happy today. I mean, it is extraordinary that here we are in her 10th decade. She's only been on holiday abroad on vacation. I mean, she's travelled the world, umpteen times. She's been everywhere, but actually to go on holiday, the number of overseas vacations she's taken is in single figures. She's been a handful of trips to the USA to look at horses, and a holiday in Normandy, France, to look at horses.
Oh, well, in that case, tell us the story of Treetops. By then, of course, she was married to Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and it was a love match, as we all know. But they were. Was it their honeymoon when they went to Treetops?
It was actually a trip in taking the place of the king, because the king was meant to be going on this big round the world tour, mainly to see his subjects in Australia and New Zealand, where they'd never seen a reigning monarch before. But he was very unwell. He'd started to get what we now know was cancer, and he couldn't do the trip. So he asked Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip to go in his place. They'd been married by this stage for just over 4 years. She was a mother of two. She had Prince Charles, and Princess Anne was really just a baby still. But this was it was in those days. This is again duty calls. She was going to have to leave the children behind, and was going to head off for Australia, and this is obviously pre-jet engine days, so they flew as far as Kenya in Africa, and then they were going to do a few days there, and then get a ship across the Indian Ocean and go via what was then Ceylon and down under, and it was going to be this sort of magical trip. But obviously they'd only been away for a little more than a week, less than a week, in fact, when the news came through. But she had no idea. I mean, she knew her father wasn't very well, but he was there at the airport to wave her off. And she and Prince Philip were thrilled to be in Africa because this was sort of an adventure. They'd been given a wedding present by the Kenyan government of a house called Sagana Lodge. It was a sort of large bungalow next to a national park. In fact, they had an early problem just before they arrived, when a leopard managed to climb into the bathroom and got stuck, which they found immensely amusing. So they arrive in Nairobi, the capital, and they did various formal engagements, and then they got 2 or 3 days off to go and see this wedding present, this house they've got. It was on a lease. I mean, they weren't handed it in perpetuity, but it was a nice thing to have. And then go on a safari. The Queen had always wanted to go on a safari, and there was this extraordinary tree house built into a giant fig tree in the Aberdare National Park called Treetops. And it was very well known at the time. It was a sort of thing travellers did. If you were in Kenya, try and go to Treetops. And I went back there a few weeks ago because I thought I want to go back to see where it all happened. It's rather sad now because of the pandemic. It's all locked up. The area around it, the tree house itself was later torched by terrorists. It was horrible. They even dragged out the staff and executed them. I mean, it was not a happy ending, I'm afraid, to the treehouse. But at the time, it was this sort of blissful, idyllic place. And on the afternoon of the 5th of February 1952, the Queen and then Princess and Prince Philip arrived. And you have to sort of, in those days, you had to sort of walk for about 600 yards through fairly thick wood to get to this clearing, and then climb up a 30-foot ladder into the tree. And on the day she arrived, there were some elephants on the rampage. It was a worrying moment. It was genuinely sort of, the protection unit were not best pleased, but they were determined to go ahead. And she went up the tree, followed by Prince Philip, and they spent the evening there just watching wildlife, and she absolutely loved it. She took photos and cine film, and was up very early the next morning to sort of see the animals back at the watering hole. And then she left after breakfast in the tree, and of course by then her father had died. She didn't know. In fact, she was one of the last people in the world to know. She then went back to this guest house, this Sagana Lodge, to sort of prepare to leave for the Indian Ocean and head off over the sea. And it was only really by mid-afternoon the news came through via a sort of rather circuitous route, and she was told, and her private secretary told Prince Philip's equerry, who told Prince Philip, who took her out into the garden and said, I've got very bad news.
And then her life changed.
Her life was upside down. Yeah.
I mean, they always talk about how she went up to Treetops a princess and came down a queen, and I suppose really she did.
She did. It's sort of fairy tale stuff, isn't it? I mean, it really was. She was. So we don't know exactly at what point the king died. We know that he was seen shutting a window in his bedroom just before midnight by the night watchman, and we know that the next morning when his valet went into his room with a cup of tea at 7:30, the king was dead. But so at some point between those two moments, he died in his sleep, we assume. And
she became queen. I've got something else to show you that was in my mother's collection, and it's a pop-up book of the Queen.
Ah, look at that! Wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely gorgeous. And again, if you look through this, you'll see how revered she was by then, obviously, because she was this very young, very beautiful princess. And if you look inside, you see the pop-up nature of it, celebrating her. But it's just incredible that, as you were saying, her life utterly changed.
Yeah.
Nothing she could do about it. It is said that Prince Philip didn't much fancy. He thought he'd got more years to serve in the Navy in his own career, but he had to give that up too.
Yeah, he had a very promising naval career. He was one of the most talented young officers of his generation. He won the prize for best cadet at the Royal Naval College, Dartmouth. He had a very distinguished war, and he was really marked out for great things in the Royal Navy. He just had his first command, a frigate, HMS Magpie in the Mediterranean, and he was really he was, as I say, he was on his way to the top in the Navy, but all that came to a halt. And not just that, I mean, here you had the sort of natural leader, the sort of classic kind of alpha male naval officer, who's suddenly having to play the subordinate role because, you know, the Queen's in charge. And the palace establishment were not very nice to him in those early days. I mean, they wouldn't let him near any sort of state business. It's very telling when you see those images of the coronation. You see the Queen sitting there on her own. Of course, when a king is crowned at a coronation, he has his Queen at his side, but the rules don't work the other way around. So he was very much marginalised. He wanted to stay, they both wanted to stay at Clarence House, which is where they were living at the time. They'd just renovated it. It had been a complete wreck and it had been bombed in the war. They'd done it up and they had a very happy time there. And they loved it. And they thought, well, you know, we could live there. We could sort of, you know, commute up the road to Buckingham Palace during the day. You had the Queen, the former Queen, now the Queen Mother, who was still living at Buckingham Palace and didn't really want to move out. So she was sort of saying, well, I'll stay put. And they went, that's great. And then Churchill, Winston Churchill, her first prime minister, and Tommy Lascelles, her private secretary, whom she'd inherited from her father, they both said, no, you've got to move to the palace. Monarchs belong at the palace. That has to happen. And so they very reluctantly, but, you know, again, duty calls. So they packed up and moved up the road, and that's been, you know, the Queen's sort of official home ever since. Although it's absolutely no secret that it's one of her least favourite homes. She's much happier at Windsor, Sandringham, and Balmoral.
Yes, absolutely, and she is very much at Windsor nowadays, and they say that she's bringing the family in around her to come towards Windsor, and there are lots of cottages and places where others can stay. A lot of people watching, if they ever get to Windsor, they will be shocked, won't they, by the Windsor Castle, huge and wonderful castle though it is plonked right in the middle of the town, isn't it? It's incredibly accessible.
Yes, and next to an airport, which is very, very, very inconsiderate. I mean, it's the largest inhabited castle in the world. It's got something like, it's more than 1,500 rooms. It's got 13 acres of roof, so there's a lot of maintenance required. And it is just rather wonderful. And one of the first things that the Queen did when she became Queen was to put Prince Philip in charge of, give him this ancient post of Ranger of the Great Park. It's a very ancient title that goes back to Norman times, and he held that post actually right up to his death. He retired from some of his other jobs, but not that one. And he loved it. And if you go to Windsor and anywhere in the park, you'll see his handiwork there. I mean, he's sort of transformed the place, because after the war it was in a pretty dreadful state. And he's done all sorts of things there. I mean, he's even installed a vineyard that now makes sparkling wine that's so good that the Queen serves it at state banquets. So when world leaders come and they do the toast, they're actually toasting it with sparkling wine made from Prince Philip's grapes in the garden. And when the castle had that terrible fire in 1992, it was Prince Philip who led the conservation exercise. So it's obviously the seat of royal power. I mean, it is the House of Windsor, but it's very much a home. The Queen loves it there, and obviously she was locked up in it effectively for the best part of the Second World War. Because it was safe, but despite all that, she's devoted to the place.
You recently attended a literary event with the actress Joanna Lumley, who's also written and made films about the Queen. They've got a lovely little clip from this event where Joanna tells the story of a really lovely moment that happened on Coronation Day.
It's exciting. I love some of the stories I've got are from little people. One standing, she'd come from school and she was drenched wet, and it was Coronation Day and they'd been waiting. The coach had debunked them. I think they were along the embankment. And of course, the journey that the great state coach took was very circuitous, to see as many people and let as many people see the coach as possible. And this little one waiting, and there was the coach. And she waved her sodden little flag with her dripping hair down by the thing. And she said, the Queen looked at me. I think she looked at me, and I was 13 years old in class 10. And she looked at me, and she knew it was me. And then it went on by. And people must have said, no, darling, she was looking at me. But she did, the Queen did look at her. Because I have a great belief in this. The Queen looked at that little one. And she's kept that in her heart all her life, that the Queen looked at her.
And time and again, you meet people who say that the Queen made me feel like $1 million. And certainly there are times when I've met her and I've been photographed meeting her, and she looks as though she's absolutely thrilled to meet you. Hardly knows who I am at all, of course, but she looks thrilled to meet you. She's got that magic about her, hasn't she?
She has. I mean, she has a great human connection. She loves the human dimension to the job, if we call it that. It's something she's always enjoyed. I mean, she makes an effort because she knows that it might just be another day at work for her, but for all the people she meets on that day, for them it'll be one of the most special days of their life, and they'll remember it. And you can't let them down. It's why, you know, even in the darkest days when she's had the most appalling challenges, she's still got on with the job because she hates letting people down. I mean, really up until very recently, when her health very understandably meant that she had to start slowing down, really up until her 90s, it was very, very unusual for the Queen to miss an engagement through ill health. I mean, you know, a handful of occasions, because, you know, she appreciates all the effort that's gone into it, what a big deal it is to have a royal visit. And so, you know, it again, beauty. It's sort of her obligation on her to make sure everybody does have a nice time. And yeah, people come away. It's very interesting when people have been at investitures to receive decorations and honours, and I tried to add up how many she's handed out in her reign. It's impossible. I mean, it's in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands. But often at those investitures, you go up to people afterwards and say, well, how do you feel? And it's sort of, again, it's one of them, the sort of greatest days of their life. They've received whatever it is, an MBE, a Member of the British Empire medal from the Queen. And then you say, and what did you talk about? They go, oh, we talked about all sorts of things. I go, well, what? And they go, oh, I can't remember. And people can never remember what they say because they're so caught up in the moment. And then you say, how long did you talk for? I said, oh, probably about 5 minutes. And actually, because of an investiture, she's never got more than probably 20, 25 seconds per person. But it just feels like you've had the attention and you've had this moment with this extraordinary figure. And it's part of the magic of monarchy. I mean, it just is.
We've got lots of pictures, of course, of her meeting people all over the world, traveling, and we've got some of her in Toronto meeting people. I think those are there, where she turns out Prince Philip usually always by her side. Sadly, not at the moment, not now. But there was one time when I think she went to NASA and was able to speak to the astronauts on the International Space Station. She's up for anything, actually, isn't she?
She is. I mean, actually, it's interesting you should say that. She does. I think she has a real soft spot for space. On all her trips to the USA, there would be a sort of a space dimension whenever possible. Yeah, she's been to both Houston. She's been to other NASA places. When Britain's first astronaut returned and Canada's first astronaut returned from space, they were invited round to see her. And of course, she famously invited Neil Armstrong to the palace not long after he came back. He planted he left a time capsule on the surface of the moon, and in it is a micro disc with a message from the Queen in it. So she has actually she's made her mark on the moon. One day someone will land on the moon and find this message from the Queen, sort of saying, you know, best wishes.
Who knows? She's, of course, as you said, she's met so many world leaders, but over time she's had some special relationships with a couple of them, hasn't she?
Yes, I mean, over the years, particularly through being head of the Commonwealth, which is the sort of if you like, the sort of club for former British colonies that used to comprise the British Empire, but then, of course, all became independent, autonomous, entirely free to do what they like. But what they almost, without exception, with two exceptions, what they all chose to do was to join this sort of post-colonial club, because they all share the same language, the same legal system, the same parliamentary system, the same way of doing things. So it makes sense. And the Queen is what sort of binds that organisation together, and it's for the most part it's a sort of very amicable, friendly one. And we see her there with some of the early Commonwealth leaders. I mean, back in at the start of her reign, I mean, the Commonwealth only had 8 member states. Now it's got 54. I mean, that's just an indication of of how much it's grown. But yes, one of her great friends in those early days was Nehru, the founder of modern India. And then, in subsequent years, she was very fond of, for example, Ronald and Nancy Reagan. They were of a similar age, and there's that wonderful image of the two of them riding in Windsor Great Park. While I was writing my book, actually, I managed to get my hands on some classified Foreign Office files, which had never been seen before, about that trip. And it's very interesting that it was Reagan's first big overseas tour. He was coming to Europe for the first time as president, and he was coming to a NATO summit, he was coming to a G7 summit, he was coming to address both houses of Parliament in Westminster. He was also on his way to the Vatican to meet the Pope. So he had quite a lot in his diary. But what the files show, you see all the diplomatic traffic between London and Washington in the run-up to that visit. What he was really most concerned about was his trip to Windsor to go riding with the Queen. He was so excited about it, and there were endless sort of telegrams about which horse is he riding, what saddle is he getting, what should he wear, and he absolutely loved it. And it was a very important time for Britain, because at the time Britain was fighting a war in the South Atlantic. We were trying to liberate the Falkland Islands, and the Queen's son, Prince Andrew, as he was then, was part of that force. So Britain needed America's help at the time, and couldn't go about it much better than having the Queen having the Reagans to stay, and the Reagans loved it.
Well, the love horses would have helped as well. Oh, we've got another shot, I think, where the Queen's looking particularly thrilled with President Bush.
Yes. I was lucky enough to interview George W. Bush for this book. We had a lovely chat, long chat, because of all the presidents. And it is remarkable. He thinks, and I agree with him, that she's probably the only person in history who's met and known 14 presidents. That's not far off a third of the total, because she met every president, starting with Truman, who she met as a princess, right up to the present day, to Joe Biden, with the exception of Lyndon B. Johnson. She didn't meet him for just their paths didn't cross, but although he wanted to meet her, obviously. But she also met President Hoover, in his retirement. So altogether, that's 14 presidents. But I think George W. Bush is the one who knew her best, because he first met her when his father was president. So he got to know her then when she came to Washington on a famous state visit in 1991. He was even wearing a pair of cowboy boots that he'd had made in Texas with "God Save the Queen" engraved on them, which he was very proud of. His mother said, "You're not going to show those to the Queen, are you?" And he said, "Yeah, of course I am." And the Queen was she remembered. I spoke to someone else, and she remembered George Bush's cowboy boots. And then some years later, 16 years later after that, he himself was in the White House welcoming her to Washington himself. So, and he paid a state visit to Britain. He met her many times. He had a very nice line, actually, which he said, what I really like about her is she takes the job seriously, but she doesn't take herself too seriously. And I think that's a very telling point about her, is that she does have a sort of self-deprecating way. She is, she's obviously very conscious of her position. She is Her Majesty, she is the monarch, but at the same time, she doesn't expect people to sort of make a ridiculous fuss of her. She's very pragmatic, she's very practical. Well, and I think you look at something like that Olympic opening ceremony in 2012, where there's that extraordinary video which took the whole world, took the whole royal family as well by surprise, when there's James Bond arriving at Buckingham Palace. Oh, and that's oh my gosh, it really is the Queen, and that's a wonderful moment. And she didn't tell the rest of the family. No, she decided she was going to keep. She didn't want it leaking out, so it really was a surprise to everybody, and everyone sitting in the royal box. And she didn't even tell her grandchildren. I interviewed Sebastian Coe, Lord Coe, who basically put the Olympics together. He was obviously in on on the joke, but he was sitting just behind Prince William and Prince Harry at the opening ceremony. He said they hadn't a clue, and suddenly when they saw the Queen with James Bond jumping out of the helicopter, he said there was this great moment where he heard one of the princes shout, "Go, Granny, go!" And I interviewed the Queen of Denmark. She was there, and she just I started watching it. I saw James Bond arrive at the palace, and I thought, well, that's interesting. And then you see the back of this person, and I thought, I can't be the Queen, and it was, So I mean, it shows. I mean, it shows two things. One, she's prepared to enjoy a joke at her own expense, but B, she's very good at keeping a secret.
Yes. I wonder how many secrets that's the frustration for somebody like you, is that how much you would love to interview her.
No,
yeah. Where would people start?
Exactly. Where, I mean, it's a bit like writing this book. You sort of, oh gosh, where do we begin? But
I mean, how many? You've been talking about the number of people and this different sorts of people, from the Queen of Denmark to the footman of whatever. To try and just get these little nuggets, these colourful stories. How many people did you interview for this book?
That's a very good question. I think it must be around 100. I was lucky enough, as I said, interviewed US President George Bush, interviewed 6 of the Queen's prime ministers, three of her British prime ministers, Tony Blair, John Major, David Cameron, 3 of her Australian prime ministers, interviewed lots of other ministers. Had a great chat actually with a guy called Ben Rhodes, who was the very key part of Barack Obama's administration, who was his sort of chief speechwriter and organised a lot of his overseas tours. And he organised the Obama's 2011 state visit to Buckingham Palace, which was a really key moment because at that point, up until then, the British and the US governments, they weren't particularly close. You had the Obama White House, the Cameron in Downing Street, they didn't have a great deal in common, but there was this great connection between Barack Obama and the Queen and Michelle Obama as well. They really got on, and there was some lovely stories from that state visit when Obama came and he and Michelle were just sort of absolutely loving it and wouldn't really go to bed. The banquet had finished and everyone was sort of standing around enjoying after dinner drinks, and the Queen, coming up to her 90th birthday, it was sort of past her bedtime, and she so I interviewed the former Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain, George Osborne, who said the Queen came up to him at one point and said, do you think you could tell the President it's time to go to bed? and George Osborne said, oh, I'll try. And he went over and talked to the Queen's private secretary and said, look, what do I do? I can't just tell Barack Obama to go to bed. And so the private secretary sort of gently let it be known that it was probably time to retire. And so Ben Rhodes was telling me what happened next. So they're back in the Belgian suite where the Queen puts all her special guests when they come and stay at the palace. And it's by now quite late. And Obama is sitting up with Ben Rhodes because he's got a big speech to make at Westminster in the morning. And they've got to go through the speech. But before that, he just said Obama just wanted to relish the moment. He just wanted to talk about this amazing evening he'd had and how the Queen could just talk to him about all his predecessors in a way that nobody else could. And he'd really, he just thoroughly enjoyed it. And suddenly in the middle of all this, there's a sort of knock on the door, and it's a footman saying, I'm very sorry, Mr. President, but we've got a mouse. We've seen a mouse. And at which point Barack Obama said, don't tell the First Lady. She hates mice. And Michelle Obama was in the next door room getting ready for bed, and he wasn't remotely bothered about a mouse, but he didn't want her to find out that there was a mouse. So there's a sort of mouse hunt going on late at night to stop the mouse getting anywhere near the First Lady. They are very sort of strange Victorian quarters where the Queen puts up her guests. It's the only presidential accommodation that any president stays in which doesn't have an ensuite bathroom because it's so old. You have to sort of walk down a corridor to go to the bathroom. And you'd think that, here's this world leader, the most powerful man in the world. He's been invited to dinner. He's been sort of sent to bed early. He's got the sort of vermin infestation, and he hasn't even got a sort of ensuite bathroom. He might find that this isn't a great trip, but of course, no, he absolutely loves it. He had a whale of a time, and right the way through his presidency, actually, there was these recurring meetings at various events. you know, when Michelle Obama was coming through London with her daughters at one point, and the Queen heard they were coming to town. It was an entirely private visit. She said, "Oh, ask them around for tea," and she laid on a carriage ride around the garden for the girls in a pony and carriage, and you know, things like that. It explains, you know, we often hear about, you know, the special relationship or the Queen's relationship with these world leaders, but because there's no politics involved, you know, she leaves the sort of the mucky stuff, the politics, you go and deal with Downing Street over that stuff. It's entirely personal. And same with Donald Trump, same with the Reagans, you know, Bill Clinton, you go right the way back, and with other world leaders, with French presidents. Probably the world leader I think she had a totally unique relationship with was Nelson Mandela, because you know, she loved the Commonwealth, and he loved the Commonwealth. His first act as an executive act as an elected president of South Africa was to rejoin South Africa to the Commonwealth. It had been ostracized for decades because of apartheid, and she wanted to be one of the first people to go and visit South Africa once he was president, and they just got on famously. He was the only world leader who could call her Elizabeth and get away with it. Nobody else, you know, she was Her Majesty, but he just called her Elizabeth. The officials would sort of, some of his officials go, "You can't call the Queen Elizabeth." And he go, "Why not? It's her name." And she loved it. She couldn't care less. She just had you know, an awful lot of time for him.
Yes, coming from him, it was almost a compliment for her. Yes. You interviewed Tony Blair, you said there, and I have to say, what I said to you before we started, that when I had this book, the first bit I went to was about Princess Diana and her sad death, and the way the royal family handled it, because obviously a movie was made about it. So when you interviewed Tony Blair, what did he have to tell you about the People's Princess and that terrible week?
Well, he was sort of very correct during that week. I mean, what was extraordinary, really, is that Tony Blair had only just come to power, as it were. I mean, he'd only been elected as Prime Minister a few months before. So he didn't really know the Queen very well, and the Queen didn't know him. Suddenly there's this extraordinary tragedy unfolding. And he, I think, did the right thing. He was concerned to make sure that he put a sort of protective arm, if you like, around the monarchy at a time when it was getting a lot of criticism. But her priority was the boys. You know, had all the media and everybody saying, you know, we want to see the Queen. We want the Queen to sort of emote publicly and show that she cares. And as far as she was concerned, she was, you know, she had the two sons, her grandsons, staying at Balmoral with her, and she just wanted to make life as comfortable and as bearable as possible for these two very traumatized teenage boys, and that was her priority. And so Tony Blair had a you know, a bit of a he writes about it in his memoirs. Actually, he's quite candid there about how he was trying to sort of coax the monarchy into sort of showing more sort of public side to their bereavement. But what I found particularly interesting researching this book, I mean, I interviewed Tony Blair about it before, and he said the Queen actually, you know, she got it, and he's always been very impressed by the broadcast she eventually gave at the end of that week. But what was really interesting was talking to the man who organised the funeral, the Lord Chamberlain at the time, Lord Airlie. He's a very old friend of the Queen. They grew up together, and he was quite cross actually about this sort of this narrative that somehow the monarchy was sort of caught napping during that week and had to be told what to do. He pointed out that all the key elements of that funeral, that famous funeral that was watched by 2.5 billion people around the world, that had all been decided by the Queen and her officials within 36 hours of Diana's death. The idea that you would have a different sort of funeral, you'd have all of her charities represented there, that there would be a sort of, that basically they were just going to tear up the old blueprint for royal funerals and do something different. And that had all been approved, but none of that has really, you know, got through, because Tony Blair wrote his account of that week in his memoirs, and his press secretary, Alistair Campbell, wrote his account, and that formed the basis of the film with Helen Mirren, the Queen. So I think people think that's official, that's what happened. But there's another side to it, because all the people around the Queen don't write diaries and memoirs and this sort of thing. Luckily, one of them was happy to talk to me, so I have got a sort of different take on it. But what was extraordinary was at the end of that week, after all those tensions and a lot of the accusations, criticism levelled at the monarchy, as soon as the Queen came back to London, as soon as she engaged with the public, both walking among the crowds and then delivering her broadcast to the nation, I mean, everything just changed, the whole mood. And I remember it so clearly because I was a royal correspondent at the time. The mood just changed, and she does have this ability just to change the whole tempo, the whole mood of a situation.
All of us remember as well, of course, I mean, the Queen bows her head to no one, but she did to Diana as her coffin passed.
Yes, very significant moment,
wasn't it?
Yeah, that was you know, again, you know, the Queen trades in sort of small gestures which mean an awful lot. I mean, they have a huge impact, little things when they come from the monarch, and that was a huge sign of respect.
I love the little nugget of information you found when they were planning the funeral, and in the end they gave the spot, as it were, the musical spot, to Elton John, who rewrote Candle in the Wind. But apparently Placido Domingo wanted in on that.
Yes, he rang up midweek to say, look, you know, I knew Diana, I'm terribly upset. I'd be delighted to sing at her funeral. And the Lord Chamberlain's sort of right-hand man, who has the extraordinary title, the Comptroller, but he was very central to organising it all. He said, look, it's very kind of you, I'm very sorry, but the job's gone. You know, Elton John was already booked. But it was, yes, I mean, that was an extraordinary funeral. And
you were there, weren't you?
I was there, yeah. I was in the Abbey, actually sitting on a sort of press gantry opposite the royal family. The cameras were, the BBC were filming it, and they had sort of fairly strict protocols not to sort of keep homing in on the family, quite understandably. I mean, you know, two very upset young men in the front row there. But we were sitting opposite, and it was, you know, it was desperately sad, but they were very controlled. I was incredibly impressed with those boys that day, and with Prince Charles as well. I mean, incredibly hard to walk all that way behind the coffin. Very, you know, very traumatizing. But
knowing and fearing that there were a lot of people who blamed him for a lot of unhappiness, and he was very. Didn't he actually speak to friends the night before? You found out.
Yeah, he did. I spoke to one or two of them. He was ringing around. This is Prince Charles the night before the funeral, ringing around his oldest friends just to say, look, you know, he wasn't too melodramatic, but I mean, he made it quite clear, you know, this might be the last time we chat. And there was a serious concern. The police were very worried, but I think, you know, everybody could see just how important he was to those boys, and has been really ever since. And you know, he even his critics. I mean, I'm a huge supporter of Prince Charles. I think he's been a remarkable public figure, but even his harshest critics have to concede that, you know, he did a very good job holding it together at home with those boys. And okay, you know, Harry may have his issues now with his royal existence, as was, but all through their teens, and you know, they were a very close family unit.
Yeah, and hopefully they will be again.
Yeah.
You become so known and trusted by them. I mean, I know you've been a royal correspondent and you've written for years, but at some point they clearly they invite you to things. They don't sort of wait for you to always ask. They actually invite you and give you special access to things, like the King's memoirs, for instance. You even watched the Queen do a Christmas broadcast, didn't you?
Yes, I was lucky enough to watch her. I was making a documentary about her, and was able to filming her or recording her Christmas broadcast, and it was quite funny actually, because I didn't expect it to be, and she is known within the sort of the TV industry as one take Windsor, because she always does it in one take. You know, she's so accomplished. I mean, fascinating. It was 1940 she made her first broadcast, and she's been broadcasting, you know, fairly regularly ever since. I think you could say she's probably the most experienced broadcaster in history. I don't think there's anyone else still broadcasting who was broadcasting in 1940. But on this occasion, it wasn't one take, because she got halfway through it, And the rather terrified sound technician said, I'm very sorry, ma'am, but I think we're going to have to do this again. And so, really, why? And there were some birds outside the window tweeting away, and the microphones were picking up bird song, which might sort of seem sort of very nice and sweet, but is actually slightly distracting. So I'm afraid that the wildlife won, and the monarch had to do 2 takes.
You call it Queen of Our Times, and as I said at the beginning, you sort of set her within her times. And of course, even though she's 96 and hopefully going to enjoy the Jubilee celebrations and years to come, I mean, her mother went on till 101, didn't she? So hopefully she will continue. But she's clearly building the future of the monarchy now, isn't she?
Yes, I mean, if you run a hereditary dynastic institution, rather like if you run a family business, your first priority is passing it on to the next generation in good condition, hopefully as good, if not better condition than you found it. And that's always been a priority for her. I think she's in the unusual position, really only Queen Victoria before her, of being able to look 3 reigns distant. You know, there's a lovely photograph of her with Prince Charles and Prince William and Prince George, which was taken at the time of her 90th birthday, and it's very sweet because you know, there you are. That is the sort of the future. You're pretty much looking at the next 100 years there, and you know, Prince Charles, as I say, he's in the same way she's been our longest reigning, longest lived monarch, he's been our longest serving heir to the throne. And you know, people keep sort of speculating what sort of a king will he be. Well, I think very correctly he's not telling us, because to start talking about his plans would be very disrespectful to his mother. So he doesn't do that. It does mean that we all sit around speculating. But she has reformed the institution very cleverly, very extensively, but so to the point that people haven't really noticed. But actually, on her reign, the thing the institution is completely different. I mean, there was in one afternoon in 2011, all the succession rules were just changed, so that no longer did a prince trump a princess when it came to the succession. There used to be a bar on members of the royal family marrying Roman Catholics. It all went back to the Stuarts. It's sort of old bit of law, but that's been cleared up. The funding arrangements for the monarchy, which have been in place for 250 years, that's been replaced. Internally, she's changed what she inherited, which was very much an old-style aristocratic court run by people who were there largely on the basis of birth. Now it's a completely meritocratic institution. It compares to any sort of medium to large size government department in terms of representation of women and minorities, all that sort of thing.
And she's made it very clear, hasn't she, already, that Camilla will be queen? Yes,
yeah, she's cleared that one up, because I think it was interesting, the timing of that. It came not long after, well, less than a year after, obviously, the death of Prince Philip, and I think she had always realised just how central Prince Philip was to the success of her reign. I think she's the first to admit she couldn't have done it without him. And I think you've got to have if a monarch needs a happy consort, whether it's a man or a woman at their side, and you can't really have a very happy consort if you've got the first woman in history married to a king who's not a queen. So there's a logic to it, and Camilla has been a great asset. I mean, she married into the family in 2005, really at an age when most of her friends were starting to look sort of retirement, really. And she's taken it on, and she's always very good natured, even in sort of difficult circumstances. And she's got her own program of events. She's devoted to her charities. She's got a great sort of sense of humor as well. It's when you're on a overseas tour and it's a sort of hot day or whatever, and she knows, she has sort of some sympathy for the media. When the cameras are sort of switched off, she'll sort of have a chat with people to sort of check everyone's all right. And, she's fun. Former US ambassador who was Donald Trump's ambassador to the UK, Woody Johnson. I interviewed him shortly before Donald Trump's state visit. And he'd recently sat next to Camilla at a dinner. He said his words were, "She's a riot. She's the real deal." So I think she'll be a great queen when the time comes. But let's hope not for a very long time.
Absolutely, but she must also have confidence in looking beyond even Charles and Camilla to William and Catherine, because my goodness, they're doing well, aren't they?
Yeah, they've had their challenges. Prince William had to sort of grow up, without his mother in the public eye, and I think Kate has brought this great degree of stability to his life. He's devoted to his young family, and they're a very sort of solid couple. I sort of see in a funny way in them, I see a lot of the sort of characteristics of George VI and Queen Elizabeth. They slightly remind me in that they're not. Whereas Prince Charles is quite a sort of intellectual at heart. I mean, he's always sort of deep in a book and asking kind of questions about the meaning of life and all that sort of thing. I don't think Prince William does that. I think it's more a case of, right, let's get on with it. But they're very solid, and they're clearly already starting to take on very sort of senior roles, because Prince Charles will be 75 next year. Whatever happens, his reign is going to be a relatively short one. He knows that. Everybody accepts that. And it's very important that the monarchy is well set up for not just the next reign, but the one after that. And when I was doing my book, actually, I talked to some of William's close staff, and they made the point that he doesn't just think about his reign. He's very conscious of the fact that he's bringing up a future monarch himself.
Yes. So, Robert, then, what's the next book about, or who is the next book about?
My wife has made me promise not to write another book for a bit, because they do tend to eat into holidays and evenings and weekends, because I also have a day job as a journalist. So, I'll try not to write another book about the Queen. I think she must feel that that's enough, Mr. Hardman. Thank you, but go and pick on another member of my family.
I tell you what, there isn't a picture of you with the Queen here. Have you had a picture taken of you with the Queen?
Yes, there are one or two images of me with the Queen. I mean, I met her several times, both while as a journalist and also while making documentaries about her. We had a long chat once when we were making a film for her 90th birthday, and we were filming her riding. I mean, it's extraordinary. She, until very recently, she would be regularly out riding on her favourite fell pony. And yeah, we spent a morning with her, just her and her horses in the stables at Windsor, and it was a very happy chat. She's very involved in everything that goes on around her. She likes to know the micro details as well as the big picture stuff.
Well, it is incredible that we are actually celebrating the first ever Platinum Jubilee of a monarch. And somebody, as you said, is probably the most famous woman in the world. Long may she be so. Robert, thank you so much for joining me today. It's absolutely fascinating talking with you about the Queen, and because all of those little nuggets of information nobody else knows. So thank you for that, and thank you for the book too.
Thank you.
It's called Queen of Our Times, The Life of Elizabeth II. In all good bookshops all over the world, as they say. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Anne. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. Well, there you are. That's a sort of crowning glory to a lovely week celebrating the Queen this week here on Viking.TV. Well, until I see you again, do stay safe, stay happy, and goodbye.